A tarp is one of the best pieces of stealth camping items to have in your kit. They are lightweight, they pack down really small, and they are super versatile. You can set them up high so that you can walk around underneath them, or you can make some low profile shelters to avoid being seen by people. And in this video, it's the low profile shelters that we're going to look at. The lowest, and without doubt the stealthiest shelter you can make with a tarp, is a flat lay. This is the simplest and fastest tarp shelter you can make. For the demonstrations in this video, I am going to use a super light 2.9 by 3 meter tarp, but you can set up all of these configurations with just about any tarp. The main thing they do need to have is plenty of tie-out points. It's also worth noting that I tend to use tarps that are dark in colour, either dark green or dark brown. To start with, lay your tarp out flat on the ground. Make sure the area you are setting up in is clear of any large sticks and branches. Some tarps come with pegs, but these are often very thin and not very strong, so either replace them with stronger pegs or whittle your own using a knife. Then peg out each corner of your tarp, but make sure that you don't pull the tarp really tight, otherwise you won't be able to raise it off the ground. Now most tarps come with at least 4 tie-out points. If your tarp has none at all, you can just wrap the corner around a small stone or a pine cone and then tie a loop of cordage to this, and this can then act as a makeshift tie-out point. Once you have pegged out all 4 tie-out points, the next step is to cut a short stick which will act as your centre pole. How short you cut this stick will dictate how high your shelter will be. Given this video is focused on low profile shelters, we're only going to cut this stick to a few feet in length. This one I cut to around about 2 feet. I then used a knife to bevel one end of it. You don't have to, but it helps to stop the stick from ripping the tarp material. If you don't have a knife, you could just bunch up a few leaves on top of it to pad it out. Now push the stick underneath the front of the tarp and the shelter is complete. It's the lowest profile shelter you can make with a tarp, and all you need is 4 pegs and a stick. You can further reduce the visibility of this shelter by adding some camo netting. Camo is generally very lightweight, and you can compress it down small into a bag. Even if the pattern of the camo doesn't quite match the surroundings, you can just use some of the nearby natural materials to help it blend in. In this case, the camo is green, and the floor of this particular forest is mostly brown from the dead beech tree leaves. But if I throw a handful of leaves on the shelter, the camo netting traps these leaves in place and the shelter blends into the surroundings much better. Here is a shot of the shelter before the camo and leaves were added. And here is a shot after. It's surprising how effective this method is at concealing your shelter. Now, the downside is that this tarp setup is very restrictive. There is very little space inside, and once you're in, that's it. No sitting up, no moving around, just hunker down for the night and get ready for a fast pack away early the next morning. If you need to head away from your shelter and you don't want it seen, you can just pull the stick away and your shelter blends in with the floor. If someone was walking by, they probably wouldn't know it was there. And it's dead easy to pack away, as there are no ridge lines or guy lines to undo. You just pull it up off the ground, get rid of the leaves, and then put it back into a stuff sack. Fast to deploy, easy to set up, but very restrictive on space. If you need a bit more space, but still want your shelter to remain low profile, then this next setup is ideal. For this, you will need a decent length of paracord to tie a ridgeline. Basically, a tight line of cord between 2 trees. I carry multiple lengths of cordage, that way if the gap between trees is large, I can just tie in another length of paracord so that it meets the required width between the 2 trees. I wrap one end of the ridgeline around one tree. At the very end of this ridgeline, I have tied a loop. I pass the other end of the cordage through this loop and then put a stick through it. I can then cinch down tight on the ridgeline and the stick will keep it all in place and stop it from slipping. If it's tied correctly, you should be able to pull the knot tight, let it go, and it should just stay there and not slip loose. Then I walk the line across to the opposite tree and wrap it around. I then loop underneath the ridgeline and go back around the tree. This helps to get extra tension on the ridgeline. Then I make a small U shape and pass a loop through this U and pull it away from the tree to tighten it. I then put my hand through this loop and grab the remaining paracord and pull it through to form a second loop. This helps to lock off the knot and stop it from slipping. Now I have a taut ridgeline that I can make multiple different shelters from. In order for all of these stealth tarp setups to be low profile, it's important that the ridgeline is tied no higher than your waist. A lot of ground vegetation in woodlands is waist height, and so if there is something unnatural looking like a tarp that sticks up higher than this, then it will likely draw attention. For the next few stealth setups, I'm going to need some small wooden toggles and some short loops of paracord. The loops of paracord are going to secure the wood toggles to the tarp. To do this, I tie a prosic loop. Essentially, I just wrap the cordage over the ridgeline and back through the loop. I do this twice and then cinch it all down. It creates what looks like a fist. This knot is great, as you can easily slide it back and forth along the length of the ridgeline when you hold it by the knot itself. But when you try and pull it from the bottom of the loop, it will cinch down and not slip at all. So I lay my tarp out flat with the front of it just underneath the ridgeline. Then I find the middle tie-out point at the front of my tarp and secure this to the middle prosic loop. I do this by putting the tarp loop through the prosic loop and then putting a wood toggle in between them to stop them falling apart. I do the same thing to the next two loops, either side of the middle tie-out point, securing them with the wood toggles. Now, to adjust the tension of the tarp, all I need to do is pull the prosic loops towards each tree and it will tighten the tarp. Then I peg down the last two corners at the front of the tarp to create the opening of my shelter. There is now loads of wasted tarp at the back of the shelter, so what I tend to do is tuck at least half of this back underneath itself, and this can act as a ground sheet to keep me dry from the damp forest floor. Then I find the middle tie-up point opposite the middle tie-up point on the ridgeline at the front and peg this down, pulling the tarp tight as I do this. I'll then peg the next two tie-up points to the side of this. Finally, I peg out the last two tie-up points and adjust any pegs to make sure that the tarp is tight. And now I have a low profile stealth tarp shelter that has its own built-in ground sheet. It's much more roomy than the flat lay and allows me room to stow my pack and still have space to lie out flat. I am protected from the elements from the sides and the back, and I have a good view of the forest in front. This is possibly my favourite type of stealth tarp setup. It is a bit more visible than the previous one, but the extra space makes it a lot more comfortable. With a few small changes, it can also be modified into more of a ground bivy, giving you a lot more room to the back of the shelter. To do this, I take out the pegs at the rear and put a stick through one of the loops. Then I tie a piece of cord to the stick and use this to peg out a guy line. The stick has essentially allowed me to raise the back of the shelter up to almost level with the ridgeline. I don't want to be totally level with it, as water needs to run off the back of the shelter. I then do the same to the other side, and I also peg out any of the remaining tie-up points at the side of the tarp. And just like with the stealth setup previously, I leave some tarp tucked underneath itself for a ground sheet. These low profile shelters are great in adverse conditions. You can see that on this day I was filming, the winds were strong, up to 40-mile-an-hour gusts, and the shelter held up no problem. Now I have the same height shelter, but a lot more space towards the back to stash my gear and get out of the elements. As you can see, there is plenty of legroom, space for my pack, and I still have good visibility in front. The downsides of these two setups are that they take a little longer to set up than the flat lay, but they offer a lot more in terms of space and comfort. Another similar low profile setup, which still has space but offers you a little more visibility, is the sea fly. To make this setup, I first drape the tarp over the ridgeline, making sure that each side is equal, so the middle ridge on the tarp is resting on the ridgeline. Then I attach the prosic loops and the toggle to the tie-up points at both ends of the tarp. Once these are secured, I tighten them up. I then peg out the tie-up point that is directly below the toggle and prosic loop, and I peg this out roughly directly below the ridgeline. I repeat the exact same thing on the opposite side. Now, this is the important bit. I fold one end of the tarp directly underneath itself and back towards the ridgeline, and secure both tarp tie-up points to the same toggle. It's really important that the tarp is folded underneath itself and not over itself. That way, if it rains, water can still run off easily. If it were folded on top, it would trap the water and the tarp would begin to sag after the first few hours of rain. With one side attached, I do the exact same thing to the opposite side. Next, I run some paracord through the end tie-up point and attach this cordage to a stick. Once it is attached, I will pull it taut and peg it out. You can now see why this shelter is generally known as a C-fly, because it forms the letter C. With one corner secured in place, I do the same to the other side, and this is generally much easier as the shelter already has some rigidity. Now the shelter is complete. I can stow my pack underneath it and use the small remaining piece of tarp as a ground sheet. This shelter has more visibility than the others and better airflow. However, it is longer to set up. If the weather really turns and you need to batten down the hatches, as they say, then you can quickly modify this shelter to make what is known as the body bag, and you'll see why in a minute. But essentially, you take out the two sticks and untie the folded piece of tarp from the ridgeline. Then repeg the corners of the tarp to form an A-frame shape, making sure that the centre point of the tarp stays even on the ridgeline. Once I've done one side, I repeat the process on the opposite side. Then I can just use the remaining pieces of loose tarp to form a ground sheet underneath. Now it's just a case of commando crawling into the shelter and hunkering down. There's not much room for manoeuvre in this shelter, but it sheds water well when it does rain. And there you have it, 5 low-profile tarp setups ideal for stealth camping. Subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and if you like stealth camping and survival tips, be sure to check out my other videos on this topic in the video description below. Cheers for watching folks, and I'll see you in the next one.